I'll kick things off with one relevant to our crowd today. The weather in Pittsburgh is not always conducive to spending time outdoors. What is suggested for people to get their time in nature during uglier weather, say?
So Ithaca is not unlike Pittsburgh in its weather, and this is certainly one of the challenges that we face. But I typically have two responses to that question, which comes up frequently. The first is we're encouraging people to go out in nature 2 to 3 times a week. There are beautiful days in winter when it's cold, but the sun is shining. Maybe there's a light layer of new snow. Those are the days to get out, not the days when it's sleeting and windy and just yucky. My other response is there are a lot of wonderful winter sports, from snowshoeing to cross-country skiing, that people can be partaking of.
I can hit that. Yeah. I heard a bunch of grumbling over here that you need proper clothes, and I would agree wholeheartedly. I went camping this weekend in a tent with a 0-degree bag, and it wasn't that bad. But yeah, I mean, Pittsburgh's weather is what it is. Through our work with the Biophilic Cities Network, I think there's a lot of really good examples from places like I believe Minneapolis, some Canadian places, some Canadian cities that are doing really interesting outdoor activities in the wintertime and trying to celebrate that cold weather. Also, saunas and steam rooms are really popular, and that's something that I think we should bring here for sure.
Okay. Yeah. Cheers for saunas. Kim, I'll direct this a little bit towards you, but anyone on the panel is welcome to join. There was a question that came up in your talk, and it's sort of echoed here in this question of, is it accessed if you feel that it is not yours? How do we best encourage that sense of ownership, or the idea of sharing ownership with everyone in the community of natural spaces?
Is it access if you feel it's not yours?
Yes. Is it access if you feel that those natural spaces don't belong to you, or maybe that you don't feel comfortable in those spaces?
Well, I think if there's this idea of physical access, right? And I think when we talk about this idea of creating access to spaces, oftentimes that's the default is, we have to build the path, or we need the capital dollars to get under the highway or whatever it is. The other quick answer around access is usually money. It's transportation. We need the buses. We can't pay to get in, whatever that is. So if those are the sort of the two initial barriers, but then there's the conversation that I was addressing, which is if there's this notion of not feeling welcomed or comfortable. And I think those are the harder conversations that need to be unpacked. If we're talking about public land or public spaces, then there's a requirement, I believe, to have the conversation about where is that barrier, because it is public land and you are the owner. And if there is something that is preventing you from feeling comfortable, then there is a opportunity. I would say that we are required then to begin to unpack what is going on there. What is the training that needs to happen? What is the hiring protocol that needs to shift? What is the language that needs to show up on the website or in the brochures so that folks can begin to feel welcome and that they can participate in this land that is theirs. If it is not a public space, then I think that that's a different conversation, and therefore the access might be intentional, or the lack of being welcome in that space, and that's a different conversation that could not be welcomed. So I don't know if I'm answering the question or not.
You are. Thank you. Would anyone else like to address that? Okay. The next question is for everyone. What are the largest challenges that you foresee facing in the next few years, looking down the road a bit in your work on access to nature? What's sort of coming down the road as far as your barriers that you see?
I like challenges. I would say I think climate change and some of, as I said, but I think our changing climate, our changing temperatures, air quality in Pittsburgh specifically is a really big issue. And, with future build out scenarios, I think that's going to be a really big challenge here. That's compounded by the changing temperatures.
So I would list two interrelated challenges with getting people out in nature in the coming years. The first is I think we are going to continue to be ever more reliant on electronic technology in all of its forms. And I see young people spending more and more of their time on screens. The other is climate change is such a big and scary issue that I'm concerned that people are just going to be putting their heads in the sand. And rather than celebrating nature, and by celebrating nature, becoming environmental advocates, people are just going to run from that because it's too damn scary.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in terms of my research or psychological research more broadly, I think understanding the mechanisms by which nature can impact health is really important. And it's very difficult to do because you have kind of two ends of the spectrum are covered in terms of the research. You have these giant observational studies that consistently show, access to nature being related to all of these health outcomes. And of course, as I discussed, what is access to nature defined as in the literature? That can be debated. And then on the other end, you have these very small scale, very focused studies trying to pinpoint the exact the specific, physiological responses that people have. And so in my work, bridging that middle gap in between those is very important. And I think it's very important for people in terms of how they think about their own access. People are probably not going to be motivated to get out in nature if we just throw the research at them and tell them, oh, this is good for you. This is going to lower your blood pressure. This is going to, do all these things for you. It's hard enough to get people to eat healthy, and they clearly know that that's, good for them, right? Humans are complex. So the issue is really trying to figure out how to translate the research that we do and give it to people so that they can do something with it.
Yes, I would say funding I see as a challenge, and the way that that's interpreted is it was on your slide. What was it? Fragmentation, maybe. In that, as users, sometimes you're not paying attention necessarily to the signage, right? But if it's a state park versus a county park versus a local park, and as funding starts to dictate who has the money and who doesn't, you're going to start to notice the maintenance or the deferred maintenance in different parks or different trails, and that's going to start to impact different communities and different locations, and where parks are going to be maintained and where they're not, and therefore who's going to have access and who is not. And then the other thing is maybe a little bit about what you were saying, but more and more perhaps the schism of sort of the right way to access nature. The where you go, the how you go, the what you call yourself, the what you're wearing. I'm super concerned that that's getting worse versus just sort of like come outside and play is no longer said. There's a whole lot more that goes into that, and that's a shame.
Thanks. Rebecca, there's a line of questioning for you to tell us more about lawn alternatives and your opinions on lawns. So,
It's my favorite topic. So my two factoids that I was going to give, but now they've been asked. So the first one is a NASA study showed that lawns are actually the #1 irrigated crop in the U.S. surpassing corn. That's not a Pittsburgh study. I haven't analyzed Pittsburgh, but that's pretty astronomical. The other point that I love, or that's ridiculous, is that one traditional lawnmower, a gas lawnmower operating for 1 hour is the equivalent in emissions of 11 sedan vehicles traveling 60 miles an hour for 1 hour. And that's an EPA, or it used to be an EPA statistic. I don't know if it still exists on the website, but I pulled it from that a couple of years ago. What do I think for lawn alternatives? I had, in my last job, I worked in a suburban municipality where there's a lot of lawns, and developed, there are low growing ground covers that provide habitat that are native. That could be, you could kill your lawn and you could plant those instead. People plant bulbs, you could plant food, but I really think that increasing habitat and increasing healthy spaces is really important, especially as the climate's changing, and we have fragmented areas, and those species aren't able to move to the warmer climates that we're seeing. So killing your lawn, not mowing it is an incredible amount of greenhouse gases saved too.
This next question was initially directed at Kim, but I will broaden it to the rest of the group. It's a little more personal. Your work is inspiring. Did you have an experience as a youth that inspired you to do what you do? So I would invite all of our panelists to share if there is something personal in their own life that inspired this work.
I'm doing a lot of talking. I would say, so I grew up in the suburbs of New York and Long Island. It's a pretty, lawn-centric area.
Where?
Really? Nassau? Limbrook?
Huntington.
Weird. Whoa. What? Yes. Anyway, so we all grew up on Long Island. So we all get it. But I had never been camping before. I'd never been hiking before. I went to school to be a teacher. And then on a whim, I kind of decided to move to Washington State and live in the middle of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, which is like in between Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, and Mount St. Helens, sight unseen. So I drove out there, and I'll never forget my first road trip. We get to South Dakota, and there's like a herd of buffalo that's just kind of roaming around there. And I just assume I'm in some kind of petting zoo. And so I'm running up to get a picture. And some guy comes out of nowhere and starts yelling at me that I'm going to get killed. And then, I finally make it to Washington, and I just remember someone asked about awe earlier. My sense of awe was just kind of through the roof. And I think from there, I learned, the environment is everywhere around us, and it really needs to be protected. So that was kind of my moment.
Yes, grew up on Long Island as well, and had parents who were very much about get outside and play. But never actually saw anyone who looked like us in the places that we went, from lifeguards to ski instructors to camping. So was not ever encouraged to actually pursue this as work. Went to school to be a psychologist. And always did this on the weekends. I was that friend, God, here comes Kim. Where is she going to make us go this time? Try not to be bitter about that now, because life just sort of brings you back to what you love. But the opportunities just kept showing up, and I kept trying to, sitting with clients in therapy sessions as their counselor in training, saying do you want to go for a walk while we do this, have this conversation? And getting in trouble because they couldn't hear the recording as we were walking around campus. And I just kept pushing to sort of bring this back to what was important to me. And as I had the chance to manage parks and recreation systems later on through a sort of youth development lens, and I just sort of found my way back into this space, and was always sort of advocating for, either loudly or quietly to bring resources to communities that weren't going to show up for the community meeting, or to push against hiring practices for folks who didn't have the master's degree or hadn't been doing the activity for 100 years because it wasn't what was happening in their family or their grandparents' family. So when the opportunity to work in an organization like Youth Outside that is about addressing barriers that are preventing youth who are traditionally underrepresented in these spaces, and I had the chance to be the founding executive director / CEO, sort of presented itself. Even my father was like, you kind of need to take that job. You have been pushing for this your whole life. So here I am.
I am not from Long Island. I am from rural northeastern Ohio. I am the granddaughter of dairy farmers there. And so, growing up, I always went to the farm and, became very accustomed to their lifestyle and their appreciation for the land. My grandfather is still very good friends with the local Amish. They come over to his house all the time. They steal candy from him. They hide their cell phones in his garage. The kids do. It's wild. That's kind of where I came from. And I, always had that nice appreciation for nature. And then in addition to that, as a research psychologist, I was always really interested in understanding humans and how our social environments, including, the literal environment, nature, can impact how we see the world.
In keeping with all of those politicians we've been hearing a lot from recently, I'm not going to answer the actual question. In a previous Q&A session, the question came up about gardener versus guardian. And I've always been a gardener from a very young age. I grew up in Levittown, the sort of archetypical post-World War II suburbs. We had a tiny yard, but my mom always gardened. And I think gardening is a window into nature. And I encourage anyone who's not involved with gardening to become so, because we learn so much about the natural world from our various gardening failures.
Can we have a round of applause for all of our speakers up here?